Hello children. So once again I am here with a new video, and this is based on weathering topic. Okay, and as always I want to remind you before I start with this video that do subscribe the channel, and one more thing, you should share the link of this video with your friends and classmates so that they can also get the benefit of it. Okay, now let's start with the topic. Now first of all I want to ask you one thing, that what does this term mean? You must have used many times the word weathering, right? Weathering, denudation. What is actually the meaning of weathering? It means the breaking down of rocks into smaller particles. And you know one thing, whenever the rocks break down into smaller particles, by any reason it may be, whatever is the reason behind it, okay, whenever it breaks down into smaller particles at the same place, right, that is called weathering. Clear? So just think of it, what weathering results into. When big rock is there, it breaks down into smaller again, smaller particles, and ultimately it leads to the formation of soil. Okay, so for the formation of soil, weathering is the basic process which is required. This is why we have to study about this term, the process actually, right? And under this topic we have to discuss about the various factors responsible for it. Okay, then what are the different types of weathering, and along with that, in which areas of earth you'll find maximum mechanical weathering can be seen, or chemical, or the biological weathering can be seen, right? And what is the reason behind it? All these things we are going to study in detail. Okay, so let's continue with it. Now first of all, how we can define weathering? For that you should, now first of all, how we can define weathering? For that you should understand that weathering is a simple process of disintegration of rocks, okay, or breaking down of rocks at the same place. So whenever it is not removed, the weathered particles, the broken down particles are not removed from that place, that is called weathering. Okay, so weathering is so called because the disintegration of rocks can take place only when they are exposed to atmosphere, or you can say the elements of weather. Clear? And that is to the agents of gradation. So that is why we say it, the process, as the weathering process. Now when we say that the weathering has got its own agents, right, what are the factors or the agents behind weathering? For that you should understand one thing, weathering can be due to simple variation in temperature conditions. Okay, it can be due to some living organisms, the animals, birds, human beings, and plants and trees, right? It can also be caused by these, and moreover it can be the result of some chemical changes, right? It can be a result of some chemical processes. So this is how the weathering take place. All these are considered as the agents of weathering, right? Now the next thing we have to discuss here about is the types of weathering. The major three types of weathering are, number one is physical weathering, right? Physical or mechanical weathering. Number two is chemical weathering, and number three is biological weathering. Okay, now what is physical weathering or mechanical weathering? Basically, in the case of mechanical weathering, you should understand one thing. Whenever there is no chemical processes involved in weathering, okay, or no involvement of any living organisms we can find, so that weathering is called as simple physical weathering, or you can also call it mechanical weathering, right? That means it is caused by the effects of changing of temperature, basically the variation in temperature, okay, and the moisture or the frost action. These are the main agents behind the physical weathering. What is now chemical weathering? Chemical weathering is a little different. As the name suggests, in it always you will find there is some chemical process involved, right? So it is the weakening and subsequent disintegration of rock by some chemical reactions, and these reactions include basically the four major types, that is oxidation, then hydration, then solution and carbonation. Okay, so these are the four different processes which are involved in the chemical weathering. These processes either form or destroy minerals, right, thus altering the nature of the rock's mineral composition, and thus they break down the rocks. So this is called chemical weathering. Now what is the third type of weathering here? Biological weathering. And I must tell you one thing, biological weathering is also many times called as organic weathering. The reason for that is always biological weathering is caused by the living organisms. Okay, some or the other living organisms are responsible for it, and that's why it is also many times called as organic weathering. So it is basically the weakening and subsequent disintegration of rocks by plants, animals, microbes, or the, you can say, birds, then insects, and even human beings, right? It takes place under the influence of life. Okay, so you can say the living organisms. So this is called then biological weathering, because some living organism is involved in it, so it is called biological. Okay, so these are the three major types of weathering. Now what are the types of physical weathering? Under physical weathering, if you see, there are major four types. Okay, number one is block disintegration, then granular disintegration, then exfoliation, and another one is called the frost action. Okay, now one by one we are going to discuss about all these four types of physical weathering. Clear? First of all, whenever the block disintegration or granular disintegration take place, for that you should understand one thing, that the rocks are mainly composed of several minerals. Okay, and all minerals are having different nature of expansion and contraction due to the heat, right? So whenever for that you should take the example of any desert area. Okay, in desert areas always we say that the mechanical weathering can be seen very clearly. The reason for that is the main factor involved in it is temperature. And if you see the different regions of the world, you'll find maximum diurnal range of temperature is seen in the desert areas, especially tropical deserts. Okay, and this is the reason in desert areas the physical weathering can be seen very, very clearly as compared to any other regions of the earth. Clear? So in desert areas also, if suppose in during the daytime, because we know that the temperature goes very high during the daytime in the desert areas, right? So at the you'll find during daytime, due to high temperature, all the minerals actually expand, right? And their rate of expansion is totally different. They all vary with each other. Okay, same way when at night time the temperature goes very low, okay, it's very cold, so that causes all these minerals again to contract. Clear? And this contraction is again at different rates, right? So this is the main factor you'll find in this case, like the expansion and contraction rate is totally different in all the minerals which are forming the rock, and this causes ultimately the breaking down of rock, because that makes ultimately the entire all the particles which are forming the rock, they become loose. Okay, and that actually ultimately it leads to the breaking down of rock. Clear? And when it breaks down in the form of several blocks, okay, or the somewhat like cuboid shaped blocks, these are called as the block disintegration. Okay, and whenever sometimes you'll find that the breaking down of the rocks take place in some you can say irregular shape of the particles. There is not any such particular shape like a block or cuboid or cubical shape, nothing. So it's just irregular shape. So that is then called as granular disintegration. That means the reason is same in both. The reason of breaking down or disintegration of rock is same. Okay? The expansion and contraction at different rates. Right? So when the particles are expanding and contracting at different rates, they become loose ultimately and they break down. Whenever the particles are having certain you can say particular shape, like block shaped particles are broken down, that actually is called as block disintegration. When the particles are not having any fixed shape, these are totally irregular shaped particles, right? So that can be called as a granular disintegration. The other two types of the physical or mechanical weathering can be seen here in front of you, that is the frost action and exfoliation. For that, I must first take the example of exfoliation, because again this can be seen in the desert areas. Much better way we can find the examples of it, right, as compared to any other region. The reason is, in this again the same condition is working. That means in this case the rocks are again contracting and expanding at different rates, right? And you'll find, suppose in the desert area, I'm giving you one example of it, any rock is there, right, and the rock is actually not formed of different, in the earlier case we have discussed that the rocks are made up of different particles which may be of different minerals. Now here what happens in exfoliation, the rocks, in certain cases you will find that the rocks are made up of different layers, okay, and these layers are formed by different minerals. Clear? Not the particles but the layers. Now whenever the same thing happens at night time, again the temperature goes very low, so the contraction take place, and during the daytime the temperature goes very high, and that leads to expansion, right? Now instead of the particles, right, the minerals which are forming the particles which expand and contract, here what happens is the minerals which are forming the layers, now the layer itself, it expands and contracts it at different rate. Okay, the different layers of that rock behave in different manner, and ultimately what is the result out of it? The result is the setting, the between the different layers, okay, the joint which is there, that becomes ultimately loose, and this leads to the breaking down of rock in different layers. Okay, it somewhat, it is we can say that it resembles just like the onion. Okay, onion, when we peel, when we just take out one layer of onion, we find that again one layer is there below it, right? So it is always in layers it's coming out, right? Same way the thing happens here in the case of rocks. It actually somewhat, we can find that due to pressure release, peeling off of the outer layers of the rocks take place, right? And this process of weathering, is called as exfoliation. Okay, somehow due to the expansion and contraction rate is varying, or in certain cases you will find somehow the water percolates inside, in between the cracks or the fractures which are there in the rocks, thus leading it into breaking down into smaller particles, right? In small particles, in what form? It is just peeled off. That means layer by layer it leaves the rock. Okay, that's why, due to this nature of it, it is also many times termed as onion skin weathering. Okay, exfoliation is the actual name. Okay, but along with that, it is also many times termed as onion skin weathering, because it just resembles that. Clear? And that is called exfoliation. Now the another one is actually seen in certain, you will find the mid latitudinal areas, or in certain colder regions, okay, or you can say the cold desert areas, the frost action. Again, this is belonging to the mechanical weathering only, because no chemical change is going on, right? Now what happens in that condition? Whenever you will find that in such areas, suppose there is any rock, okay, in open, it's there on the surface, and somehow there is a crack in the rock or any space is there in the rock, and in that somehow water is able to enter within it, right, within that crack. Now what happens in those areas, the colder regions, at night time the temperature goes very low. Okay, the temperature goes so low that it is actually going below 0 degree. Below 0 degree means the water which has entered in the cracks, it is going to freeze, right? And this is again one important part of the frost action. When the water freezes, it actually needs more space, right? You must have studied this, that whenever water, the same amount of water we are having, when it freezes, when it changes into ice, it needs more space, right? So the same thing is happening here. In frost action, what happens in the joint, suppose the water has entered, okay, at night time when it converts into ice, it takes more space, and it actually causes the crack to become more wider and wider. Again during the daytime it melts, right? When it melts, again it is there in the crack. So the same thing, when it is repeated again and again and again, it actually leads to the loosening up of the rock, and the joint gets widened by the same process, and ultimately it makes the rock to break into different particles. Okay, and this particular process is called as frost action, because the main you can say factor behind this type of weathering is frost. Okay, suppose the dew, you know, dew is the ose. In the morning time we always see in the open area, suppose we find on the grasses small droplets of water we can find easily. Now when in such colder regions there is some water on the surface of rock, okay, it may be dew or any such water, suppose by rainfall that water is there on the surface, somehow the water enters, it freezes at night, right? So it ultimately, when more water is added in the same crack, again it freezes, so it needs more space. So it continues the same way, and ultimately it makes the crack to become wider and wider, and ultimately it leads to the breaking down of rock. Okay, so this is called frost action, the fourth type of mechanical weathering. Now the four types of mechanical weathering what we have discussed just now, you can find here. Number one is the block disintegration, when the joints are of the rocks actually are becoming loose, and it causes the breaking down of particles into, you can say, in the block shaped, right? Now this is called the block disintegration. When the same thing happens, almost the same thing happens, but here a little difference is there, that is the irregular shaped particles break down, that is called granular disintegration, the second one. Third one is actually the exfoliation or onion skin weathering. Exfoliation is actually when the layers are leaving the rock just like it is peeled off. Okay, so that is in the just like the onion. Okay, it is just like the onion, when we take out one layer of it, again the other layer is there, so layer by layer it is leaving the onion. So the same way the rocks are being broken down. Okay, and this particular process is called exfoliation. And the fourth one is frost action. When water gets frozen, it causes the cracks to become wider and wider, and this is called frost action. Okay, these are the four types of mechanical weathering. Now let's talk about the other type of weathering, that is called chemical weathering. Okay, now what is chemical weathering? First of all, the chemical weathering is that in which you will find the there is some or the other chemical process which is taking place. Okay, the chemical reaction is involved, and then the result is you can say decomposition or breaking down of rocks. Okay, so that is called chemical weathering. Whenever any chemical change is there or a chemical process is involved in it, that is chemical weathering. Okay, it can be in four ways basically, right? Number one is oxidation, number two is carbonation, number three is hydration, and number four is solution. Now let's talk about oxidation. Clear? Now Oxidation, basically it is in the reaction of rock minerals, okay, with oxygen which is there in the atmosphere, and thus changing the mineral composition of the rock. And the best example of it we can find in the case of rust. Suppose I'm giving you one example, like the rock is having high content of iron within it, okay, and it is there in open, right? So when the rock is there in open, it is coming in contact with the atmospheric oxygen, okay, that is one thing, and the moisture, the water vapor which is there in the atmosphere. So that ultimately causes a chemical reaction to take place, right? And this changes the iron particles which are there in the rock to change into rust, okay. And this process, it forms actually the iron oxide, and this process is called as the oxidation, a type of chemical weathering, because the rust which is formed in that rock, now that rust actually leaves the rock, okay, because rust is actually powdery mass, okay. So that actually leads the you can say the setting of rock to become loose ultimately, clear, and this causes the breaking down of rocks into smaller particles. Then this is called oxidation. Second one is carbonation. Now what is carbonation? Carbonation and solution are quite similar, okay. Carbonation is actually when the water is mixed with carbon dioxide which is there in the atmosphere. It forms a very weak acid that is called carbonic acid, and this carbonic acid, which is actually formed by the dissolving of carbon dioxide in the rainwater, okay, and when this carbonic acid reaches in any like limestone region, that can be taken as one of the best examples. In limestone area, suppose this carbonic acid has reached, it causes the dissolving of that limestone, okay, very fast. Though we all know very well that the limestone dissolves in water very well, right? But by carbonic acid, it further you can say the process of dissolving becomes more faster, and this is called the process of dissolving of limestone in carbonic acid is called carbonation. And so what is happening here? Limestone is a rock, okay. So what is happening now? That entire rock gets dissolved in water, carbonic acid, and that ultimately leads to the you can say disintegration of rock. So this is again a process of chemical weathering, a type of chemical weathering, and it is called carbonation, okay. Now number 3 is hydration. Hydration related to water, okay, by name only it's very clear, hydration. It is a form of chemical weathering in which the chemical bonds of minerals are changed, okay. And how it changed? It is changed when it comes in contact with rainwater. And in this also I can give you one example, like feldspar, right? Feldspar, when it comes in contact with water, it changes into kaolin, okay. So that again somehow it actually leads to the loosening up of the rock particles, right? The particles of the rock, and ultimately it breaks, and that is actually the weathering. And because a chemical process is involved, so it is a chemical weathering. And what is this process? Hydration, right? I hope this is clear now. Now the fourth one is actually solution. What is solution now? Solution you must have seen many times. Actually when water, the best example we can give here is that of water and some rock salt, okay. Now when water is flowing, suppose in any area, and there is a rock salt in the way, so what happens then? Rock salt means it's not totally salt, maybe some other particles are also there, some other minerals are also there. So only that part of that rock which is actually made up of salt, that will be dissolved in water, because water is a solvent and salt is a solute, and ultimately when they mix together, that forms a solvent. Understood? And the process which is involved here is what? Solution. This process is called solution, again a chemical process, right? And what it leads to? Actually it leads to the you can say decomposition of rock again, okay, or the disintegration of rocks. So this is again when the rock salt dissolves in water, So it is again, suppose a huge rock is there, entire salt out of it has gone by water, along with water. What is left behind? Just a small part of it which is not salt. Understood? So this is how the weathering take place in this case. So all these different processes which you have seen, all these are the different types of chemical weathering. Okay, now you can see here, number 1 is solution, number 2 is hydration, number 3 is carbonation, and number 4 is oxidation. You can see very clearly all these 4 are belonging to the chemical weathering. Clear? Now let's talk about another type of weathering, that is called biological weathering. Okay, first of all, what is biological weathering? That we have discussed, but once again I am telling you, any weathering or any breaking down of rock or the disintegration, decomposition, any type, when the rocks break down into smaller particles, whatever may be the reason, if the reason is belonging to any of the living organisms, it is related to any living organisms, that will be called as biological weathering. Okay, the third type of weathering. Clear? Now you can see here a few examples are given. Now number 1, suppose the human activities, various human activities are also responsible for it. Okay, like, can you give some examples? You must have seen several places like mining is going on, or excavation of various sites. Okay, construction of roads, dams, and the various buildings and all. All these things are causing what? We are ultimately breaking down the rocks. Okay, we are digging out on the surface of earth only, right? So what it leads to, when we break down the rocks due to whatever reason, we are breaking down the rocks, so ultimately that is also weathering. Okay, and who is responsible for it? Human beings, right? And if human beings are responsible for it by any reason, that will be called as biological weathering. Okay, you can take the example of agriculture, you can take the example of like dumping of wastes in open, right? Then the construction you can take, then even the mining areas you'll find. Okay, for the drilling of drilling for the purpose of taking out the crude oil and all. So that is one of the examples. Excavation sites, you can take the example here. So for any reason, if the breaking down of rocks is going on, or in the mountainous areas, you will find like the mountains are blast is actually there with the help of dynamites and all. We actually break the rocks there, right, for the purpose of construction of tunnels and roads through the mountains. So for that also, what we are doing, we are breaking the rocks, right? So in this way we are causing biological weathering. So we are also one of the factors behind it. Okay, now next is the plants. Again, the plant roots, you all must have noticed also many times, like whenever you go in any, or suppose any, to visit any monuments and all, you must have noticed many times like there's a crack in the wall, and somehow one seed has been dropped by any bird or any animals and all, right? What happens then? The seed grows into a small plant, and then as it grows further, right, the roots on the other side, they also develop. Okay, more and more, they grow more and more, and the roots, as they grow in that crack, they lead to the widening of the crack, and ultimately it makes the entire rock to become loose, right? So it causes the breaking down of that rock or any wall. Okay, over suppose any huge rock, you must have noticed many times a small plant is growing up. So that plant ultimately, if it grows well, after a few years you'll find that the roots grow up deep inside, and it will cause the widening of the crack, and ultimately that leads to the breaking down of rocks. Okay, so this is how the plants and trees also do their work, right? Then you can take the examples of a few animals, burrowing animals especially. Okay, like the rats and rabbits, all these moles, these are the animals which actually make burrows. Okay, and several insects also you can take in this case the example of it. So what is the work of these? These actually help to loosen the surface materials of the rock and thus leading to physical disintegration. And moreover, when these animals or the insects and all or any plants, when they die, again after that also the dead decaying organic matter of these animals also provide many chemicals, okay, and several acids for the disintegration of rocks. So ultimately, anyhow, if any living being is responsible for disintegration of rocks, that will be taken as biological weathering. So these are the various ways how the biological weathering take place. Now you can see a few examples in front of you. Human activities, like the first example is that of the human activities. Mining is being done. This side you can see the plant roots, okay. This is just one example, but several examples you can find easily. And the roots, as they grow, they actually cause the breaking down of rock. They cause the cracks to become wider and wider, and ultimately it breaks. So this is caused by the plants. And burrowing animals, you can see here, small insects, they make holes in the rocks. So this is how they are also causing somehow the breaking down of rock or the loosening up of the you can say rock particles, right? And this is called biological weathering. Now after this, I must tell you one more thing. In which areas the weathering of you can say the mechanical weathering, chemical weathering or the biological weathering can be seen maximum. You should know that, okay. First of all, if I give you a few examples of a few regions, suppose equatorial region. Equatorial region, generally we find like it's a very dense forested area, right? It is having too much of rainfall, humidity is too much in the atmosphere, right? And even you'll find the temperature is too high, okay. So extreme temperature condition, very high temperature. So temperature variation is not much, okay. If temperature variation will be there, understood, if the temperature variation will be there, it will lead to mechanical weathering, but it's not. So what type of weathering we can find there? Number one is chemical weathering, which is caused by the presence of water or the humidity, right, and high temperature. Both these things work in chemical weathering. And what else? Biological weathering, we can say, because too much of forested area and all the wildlife and all the living beings, biodiversity you can find there, okay. So all these things are responsible for more and more biological weathering. It's quite natural. So that is why we can say that in the equatorial region, chemical as well as biological weathering both can be seen. Now come to the next area. Suppose tropical region. Tropical region, again, it is having dry season and wet season very clear in that area, right? You will find the very clear we can say the dry season without any rains, and there is a proper rainy season. So during that period you will find the chemical weathering can be seen most. And even in tropical region also, wherever the vegetation and all that, the living beings can be seen in large number, there you will find the biological weathering can be seen most, okay. Otherwise it is good for chemical weathering. Now the region next comes is the desert region, especially the tropical deserts, okay. In tropical desert regions you will find the mechanical weathering is maximum seen there, okay. In the world over you will find the mechanical weatherings, best examples can be seen in those areas, okay. What about the chemical weathering? First of all, why mechanical weathering? Mechanical weathering because the mechanical weathering is possible due to maximum variation of temperature, and that can be seen only in this area, such a clear variation, okay. So this is one. Number two is chemical weathering. Chemical weathering is not seen at all. The reason is, for that basically the humidity should be there in the atmosphere. So humidity is not much in the desert area, right? This is the basic reason. And number 3 is the biological weathering. For biological weathering, we need large number of, you can say, the living beings should be there. But because of very harsh climatic condition, okay, such a hot condition, the living beings are seen very less. Even the vegetations cannot be seen much in the desert areas. So if the living beings are not seen much, so naturally biological weathering will not be possible there much. Understood? So this is why you can say mechanical weathering is the only weathering which can be clearly seen in that area, the desert region, especially hot deserts or the tropical deserts. Now next one is the temperate region. In temperate region, what you can say? Temperate region has got actually warm summers and cool winters. Okay, that means none of the extremes you will find. So there, what type of physical weathering can be seen? Not the exfoliation or the block disintegration or the granular disintegration, but the fourth one, that is frost action. Frost action can be clearly seen in certain parts of the temperate region. Okay, where the temperature goes, the night temperature goes very low, below 0 degree. There, this becomes possible. And in certain other cases, you will find the chemical weathering is seen in the temperate. Understood now? And the last one is the polar region, or you can say the region which is totally, you can say it's totally frozen. Okay, so there, what do you think, that whether physical weathering is possible? In certain parts, in the outer parts or the margins of the polar region, you will find there the frost action becomes possible in certain conditions. Okay, not the extreme towards the poles, you won't find it possible, because near the poles it's totally frozen. Okay, but along the margins you will find the water is there and that freezes at night. So that actually makes it possible. Frost action can be seen in the margins of the polar regions. What about chemical weathering? Yes, to certain extent the chemical weathering is also seen in these areas. What about now the third type, that is biological weathering? Can it be seen in the polar regions? Very less. Okay, why? Because again, one of the extremes can be seen here. Okay, extremes means what? Due to extremely cold conditions, very few living organisms can be found. Okay, if living organisms are less, so naturally the biological weathering will also be less. This is the reason we can see just a few cases you will find the biological weathering can be seen. Otherwise, mainly in polar region, the frost action can be seen, or to some extent chemical. I hope this much is clear to you all. And now it's time to say bye. And as I leave, before that I must remind you once again, don't forget to subscribe the channel and also share the link of this video with your friends. Again, we'll meet in the next video, right? And till then, take care of yourself. Bye.